The concept of malum in se identifies certain acts as inherently wrongful regardless of whether positive law prohibits them. Such acts, including murder, theft, and rape, violate fundamental principles of justice and morality independent of legislative enactment. In the American legal system, many statutes overlap with these inherent wrongs, creating a body of law that appears to reflect both natural justice and statutory command. However, the application and interpretation of these laws have undergone significant inversion through judicial mechanisms that obscure accountability and alter outcomes in ways that deviate from the original legislative intent and the inherent wrongness of the acts. The judiciary has evolved into a self-serving institution that generates its own rules, standards, and procedures. These creations function with the force of law, controlling the processes of adjudication, the availability of remedies, and the scope of accountability for government actors. Despite the constitutional assignment of legislative power exclusively to Congress under Article 1, the judiciary has developed an extensive body of doctrines through precedent that operate independently of direct legislative authorization. This self-generation of rules includes the management of precedent, the establishment of procedural barriers, and the creation of immunities that shield officials from liability for actions that may constitute malum in se violations. This dynamic produces profound conflicts of interest and raises fundamental questions about the authenticity and validity of judicial decisions. When the judiciary applies rules it has itself created, it engages in self-judging that compromises impartiality and good faith. The resulting decisions carry real legal ramifications for individuals and society, yet rest on foundations that lack legislative legitimacy. The self-serving nature of these structures escalates over time, entrenching institutional power at the expense of constitutional balance and the rule of law grounded in legislative authority. The distinction between malum in se and judicially managed positive law. Malum in se represents acts that are wrong in themselves, independent of any statute or judicial interpretation. These inherent wrongs form the moral core of criminal and civil liability in the legal tradition. Positive law, consisting of statutes passed by legislatures, often incorporates these wrongs into enforceable codes. The expectation is that the legal system will uphold accountability for such acts through consistent application of law. Yet the judiciary has inserted layers of interpretation and procedure that can obscure or invert this accountability, allowing some malum in se acts to go unremedied while others are selectively enforced through judge-fashioned standards. The inversion occurs through jurisprudential activities that manipulate precedent and create barriers to relief. Judicial rulings on immunities and procedural requirements can shield actors from liability for inherently wrongful conduct. This manipulation transforms the system from one that enforces natural justice into one that prioritizes institutional considerations. The overlap between malum in se and statutory law becomes complicated by these layers, leading to outcomes that contradict the inherent wrongness of the underlying acts and undermine public confidence in the administration of justice. Such inversion reflects a broader pattern in which the judiciary assumes authority beyond mere interpretation. By developing its own frameworks for applying positive law, the judiciary effectively alters the substance of legal obligations. This process disconnects the law from its legislative source and from the moral foundation of malum in se, producing a system where procedure and precedent can override the fundamental character of wrongful acts. The result is a legal order that serves institutional ends rather than the consistent enforcement of justice. The judiciary as a self-serving institution. The judiciary operates as a self-serving entity within the governmental structure. It establishes its own precedents, due process rules, and procedural mechanisms without direct legislative enactment. This self-regulation allows the judiciary to define how it interprets statutes and applies constitutional provisions. The institution thereby creates an internal system of rules that governs its own operations and the rights of those who appear before it. This autonomy extends to the formulation of standards that determine jurisdiction, remedies, and liability. This self-serving character manifests in the judiciary's control over the mechanisms of adjudication. It generates doctrines that manage its docket, protect its discretion, and limit exposure to challenges. The separation from legislative oversight enables the development of rules that prioritize institutional stability and the interests of government actors over external accountability. The judiciary thus functions not only as interpreter, but as creator of the legal environment in which it operates, leading to a closed system resistant to external correction. Over time, this self-regulation produces a contradiction with the constitutional design. The legislative branch enacts laws, yet the judiciary supplies the operative rules for their implementation. This division creates an inherent tension in which the judiciary's self-generated standards can frustrate legislative purposes. The institution serves its own continuity and power, expanding its influence through incremental doctrinal development that entrenches its authority. Key judge-made doctrines and their historical development. Stare decisis functions as a judicial policy of adhering to precedent, developed entirely by the courts as a principle of policy rather than statutory command. It binds lower courts and guides the Supreme Court, though the highest court retains discretion to depart from it. Procedural doctrines, including the federal rules of civil procedure and rules of evidence, were promulgated by the judiciary under congressional delegation but refined through judicial decision-making. Qualified immunity emerged from judicial decisions, creating a defense for officials not present in the statutory text of the relevant civil rights provisions. Standing requirements imposed judge-crafted barriers of injury in fact, causation, and redressability beyond the basic constitutional case or controversy language. Abstention doctrines direct federal courts to refrain from hearing certain cases to avoid interference with state proceedings. The political question doctrine allows courts to decline adjudication of matters deemed committed to other branches. Judicial review itself originated as an assertion of inherent judicial authority not explicitly stated in the constitutional text. Additional doctrines include the exclusionary rule and its extensions, Miranda warnings as prophylactic measures, Bivens actions for damages against federal officials, and doctrines governing choice of law in diversity cases. These standards evolved through successive judicial decisions, expanding or contracting according to institutional priorities. Collectively, they constitute a comprehensive body of judge-made law that governs the practical operation of the legal system, acting with the force of positive law despite their extra-legislative origins. Structural conflicts of interest and escalating self-serving dynamics. The judiciary's creation and application of its own rules generate self-evident conflicts of interest. Judges act as both rule-makers and rule-appliers, determining the scope of their own authority and the protections afforded to government actors. This dual role compromises the impartiality required for legitimate adjudication. Self-serving structures emerge as doctrines expand to reduce judicial workload, enhance discretion, and shield officials from liability for malum in se violations. Qualified immunity, for instance, developed into a substantial barrier to accountability. Institutional self-interest drives escalation over time. Actors within the judiciary favor rules that maximize their power and minimize constraints. Stare decisis entrenches these rules, making correction difficult without explicit admission of error. Checks and balances prove inadequate because the judiciary interprets the statutes meant to constrain it and controls access to review through standing and justiciability doctrines. The result is a ratchet effect in which self-serving features accumulate and strengthen. This escalation undermines the constitutional separation of powers. The legislature enacts laws, but the judiciary supplies the operative framework for their enforcement. When the judiciary defers to its own standards rather than legislative command, it inverts the hierarchical relationship contemplated by the Constitution. The self-serving dynamic perpetuates itself, producing an increasingly insulated institution whose decisions reflect internal priorities rather than faithful application of enacted law. The potential invalidity of decisions grounded in self-created rules. Judicial decisions that rely on self-generated rules, standards, and procedures rest on unauthorized foundations. The judiciary lacks constitutional authority to legislate rules that function as positive law. When it does so, and then adjudicates under those rules, its actions qualify as ultra vires. Decisions applying qualified immunity, restrictive standing, or abstention doctrines derive from premises not rooted in legislative enactment or clear constitutional text. This renders the outcomes inauthentic and lacking in legitimate authority. The process lacks good faith when the judiciary knowingly applies rules that contradict statutory text or exceed its interpretive role. Conflict of interest inherent in self-application further taints the proceedings, violating the requirement of an impartial tribunal. Subjects of the legal system face real consequences, including denial of remedies for inherently wrongful acts, yet the governing framework originates from the very body exercising control. This structure deprives judicial output of the authenticity necessary for binding legitimacy. Collectively and individually, judicial action under these conditions compounds the defect. The entire system operates as a self-referential order in which precedent reinforces the initial overreach. Decisions carry the force of law for those under its control while resting on defective premises. The invalidity arises from the fundamental mismatch between the judiciary's proper role as interpreter and its assumption of legislative functions through self-created doctrines. Conclusion: judge-made rules undermine constitutional balance and judicial legitimacy. The analysis reveals a profound legitimacy deficit in the current operation of the American judiciary. Judge-made rules and procedures have come to function as law, shaping outcomes in cases involving malum in se and positive law alike. The self-serving character of the institution, combined with inherent conflicts of interest, produces decisions that lack full constitutional grounding. This situation calls for recognition of the structural problems embedded in judicial self-governance. The escalation of self-serving doctrines over time demonstrates the limits of internal checks within the judiciary. Without meaningful deference to legislative authority for procedural and substantive standards, the system risks further divergence from constitutional principles. The real legal ramifications for individuals subject to these rules underscore the urgency of addressing the inauthenticity at the core of many judicial pronouncements. Restoration of proper separation of powers requires acknowledging that the judiciary's role does not encompass the creation of the rules under which it operates. By confronting the invalidity of decisions based on self-generated standards, the legal system can move toward greater fidelity to legislative authority and the foundational distinction between inherent wrongs and their enforcement through legitimate processes. This reorientation would strengthen the overall integrity of adjudication and realign the branches according to constitutional design. Individual, organizational, and societal efforts advance agendas that counter these structures, articulating realities and implementing solutions within existing institutions or through broader mobilization.